The local community hall was packed, but not with the kind of excitement you see at a rock concert or a big theater premiere. Instead, the air smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper, and the atmosphere was thick with a polite sort of boredom. It was the annual Regional Talent Showcase, an event designed to give everyone a shot at fame, no matter how small their talent might be. The audience was a mix of supportive parents, bored siblings, and skeptical locals who had come just to see. If there was anyone worth talking about tomorrow, the event had been dragging on for hours. There had been a slightly off-key singer, a magician who dropped his cards, and a dance troupe that seemed to forget half the steps. The crowd was getting restless. People were shifting in their squeaky seats, checking their watches, and scrolling through their phones to kill time. The judges, sitting at a long table in the front with water bottles and clipboards, looked particularly tired. The main judge, a man in a stiff suit who looked like he hadn't smiled in a decade, was rubbing his temples. He was ready for the night to be over, just like everyone else. Then the announcer's voice crackled over the speaker system, calling out the next name. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage, Ilara." The name didn't ring any bells. There was no cheer section, no group of friends screaming her name. Just a ripple of polite, confused clapping that died out almost as soon as it began. The heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage parted, and a young woman stepped out into the bright spotlight. Ilara looked nothing like a star. She was wearing a large, oversized gray sweater that hung loosely off her shoulders, making her look smaller than she actually was. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, messy bun, and she wore no makeup. She didn't strut or wave to the crowd. In fact, she kept her head down, looking at her worn-out sneakers as she walked toward the grand piano sitting in the center of the stage. She looked like someone who wanted to be invisible, a student who had been forced to enter the contest by a teacher or a parent. As she made her way across the stage, a low murmur started to ripple through the audience. It wasn't a murmur of anticipation. It was the sound of judgment. You could see people leaning toward each other, whispering behind their hands. The man in the third row pointed at her sweater and chuckled to his wife. A group of teenagers near the back smirked and exchanged looks, already preparing themselves to laugh at what they assumed would be a disaster. "Looks terrified," someone whispered loudly. A few rows back. "It's probably just going to play Mary. Had a little lamb or something," another voice replied. "I hope she's quick. I want to get some popcorn before the intermission." Even the judges seemed to dismiss her instantly. The female judge with the red glasses didn't even look up from her clipboard, assuming this was just another filler, asked someone to fill the time between the real performers. The main judge picked up his pen, hovering it over the score sheet, ready to give a generic C for effort mark before a single note was played. They had seen this 100 times. A shy kid walks up, plays 3 shaky notes, and walks off to polite applause. It was the cycle of the amateur talent show. Ilara reached the piano and sat down on the bench. It was a massive, shiny black instrument, and it looked huge next to her small frame. She adjusted the bench, sliding it forward just an inch, then another. The scraping sound of the bench legs against the wooden floor was the only noise in the entire hall. It felt awkward and long, and a few people in the audience let out quiet sighs of impatience. She took a deep breath, her shoulders rising and falling dramatically. The crowd saw this as nervousness. They saw a young girl shaking with stage fright, terrified of the hundreds of eyes staring at her. They felt bad for her, but not enough to stop judging her. They were just waiting for the awkwardness to end, so they could move on. Ilara reached up with both hands and gently wiped her palms on the thighs of her jeans. It was a simple gesture, but to the audience, it confirmed their suspicions. She was sweating. She was scared. She wasn't a professional. She was just a beginner thrown into the deep end. The lights above her were hot, reflecting off the piano lid, and she squinted slightly, looking at the keys as if they were a puzzle she wasn't quite sure how to solve. The room was filled with a sense of pitying curiosity. It was the feeling you get when you see a waiter drop a tray of glasses. Everyone winces, waiting for the crash. The judges were now having a quiet conversation amongst themselves, not even bothering to look at the stage anymore. The audience was distracted, their eyes drifting to the exit signs or their phones. The energy in the room was flat, heavy with the expectation of mediocrity. Everyone had already written her off. In their minds, the performance was over before it began. They had decided she was a nobody, a beginner, a waste of 10 minutes. Ilara lowered her hands toward the keys. Her posture was still slumped, still shy. She didn't pull her shoulders back or lift her chin. She just hovered her fingers over the white and black ivory, looking for a starting point. The murmuring in the crowd grew slightly louder as people started to wonder why she was taking so long. A few people coughed. The silence was becoming uncomfortable. "Just play something already," a man near the front mumbled under his breath. Ilara didn't seem to hear them. Or if she did, she didn't care. Her eyes locked onto the piano keys, and for a split second, the shy look on her face changed. It wasn't a big change. Her expression didn't suddenly turn fierce or angry. But if you had been looking closely, you might have seen the tension leave her jaw. You might have noticed that her hands, which had been trembling slightly at her sides, were now perfectly still. The fear evaporated, replaced by a terrifying, absolute focus. The audience held their breath, waiting for the first awkward plink of a nursery rhyme. They were ready to offer their pity applause. They were ready to smile and say, "Good job, sweetie," and then turn back to their conversations. But Ilara wasn't there for their pity. She placed her fingers on the keys, her left hand finding a deep bass note and her right hand hovering high up the register. The pause stretched on, agonizingly long, making the air in the room feel tight and thin. She was about to show them exactly how wrong they were. The silence in the hall was getting loud. It is a strange thing how silence can have a sound of its own. It was the sound of people shifting in their seats, the creak of leather, the dry cough from the back row. It was the sound of low expectations grinding against reality. Ilara sat on the bench, her back still slightly rounded, staring at the black and white keys as if they were written in a foreign language. The audience watched her, and the general feeling was one of pitying patience. They were waiting for the failure. They were ready to see her hands shake, ready to hear a wrong note, ready to say, "Well, at least she tried." The main judge, the one with the stiff suit and the tired eyes, had already made up his mind. He didn't even look at her. He was busy writing something on his clipboard, probably a pre-written note he used for everyone who wasn't special. He was just going through the motions. The lady judge next to him was looking at her nails, bored out of her mind. They had seen hundreds of shy kids come and go. Ilara was just another number to them, another 5 minutes of wasted time. But then something changed in the air. It wasn't a noise. It was a stillness that came from the girl on the bench. Ilara's shoulders dropped another inch, relaxing completely. Her breathing, which had looked shallow and fast from the audience's view, suddenly slowed down. She closed her eyes for just a heartbeat. When she opened them again, the shy, scared girl was gone. In her place was someone who looked intensely focused. Like a surgeon before a difficult operation or a sprinter right before the gun goes off, she placed her hands on the keys. At first, her touch was light, feather-light. She barely touched the surface. The audience leaned forward, confused. Was she going to play soft music? Was she going to play a gentle lullaby? The tension in the room tightened. Everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the first sound. It felt like the entire world was balanced on the edge of a knife. Without warning, her left hand slammed down on the lowest keys. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a strike. A deep, resonating boom exploded from the piano, cutting through the silence like a thunderclap. The sound was so loud and so sudden that people in the front row physically flinched. It vibrated through the wooden floorboards, up the legs of the chairs, and straight into the chests of everyone watching. It was a sound that demanded respect. A sound that said, "I am here." The main judge's pen froze in midair. He didn't drop it, but his hands stopped moving completely. His head jerked up, his eyes wide, searching the stage to see what had made that noise. The lady beside him stopped looking at her nails and turned her head, her mouth opening slightly in shock. Before the shock of that first note could fade, Ilara's right hand joined in. But she didn't play a melody. She played a fire. Her fingers launched into a rapid, chaotic series of notes that climbed up the keyboard like a staircase on fire. It wasn't a simple tune. It was fast, It was aggressive. It was incredibly complex. The audience sat frozen. The teenagers in the back who had been smirking looked at each other, their smirks wiped clean off their faces. The man who wanted popcorn forgot all about food. The whispers that had filled the hall just seconds ago were completely gone. The only sound in the entire room was the sound of the piano, roaring to life under Elara's hands. The music she was playing was technically difficult. It wasn't the kind of song you learn in your first year of lessons. It was the kind of piece that professional pianists practice for years to get right. Her hands were moving independently of each other. The left hand was pounding out a heavy, driving rhythm, while the right hand was dancing across the high notes with impossible speed. You could see the muscles in her forearms flexing under her baggy sweater. You could see the tendons in her hands standing out as she stretched for wide intervals. She wasn't just pressing buttons. She was wrestling with the instrument, forcing it to submit to her will, and she was winning. The change in her posture was shocking. The girl who had walked onto the stage looking like she wanted to hide was now leaning forward, attacking the keys. She wasn't shy anymore. She was powerful. Every note she played was sharp and clear, cutting through the air like a blade. There were no mistakes. There was no hesitation. It was pure, raw confidence. The judges were now fully alert. The main judge leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his eyes glued to Elara's hands. He was trying to follow the notes, trying to find a flaw, but he couldn't. He watched, mesmerized, as her fingers flew across the keys. The skepticism that had been written all over his face had melted away, replaced by a look of total disbelief. He looked at the other judges and they looked back at him, all thinking the same thing. Asterisk, who is this girl? Asterisk, the audience was realizing their mistake too. They looked at her face, expecting to see fear, but instead they saw a look of intense concentration. Her eyes were locked on her hands, her jaw set tight. She wasn't looking at the crowd. She wasn't looking for approval. She was inside the music, completely lost in it. It was like she had entered a different world. She was dragging the entire audience along with her, kicking and screaming. The tempo of the music kept getting faster. It felt like a train rushing down a track, picking up speed, impossible to stop. The sound was filling every corner of the hall, bouncing off the high ceiling, echoing in the back rows. It was beautiful, but it was also scary. It was the sound of raw talent unleashed, a beast that had been kept in a cage and was finally breaking free. People stopped looking at their phones. They stopped looking at the exits. They stopped thinking about dinner or what they were going to watch on TV later. All they could do was stare. They were witnessing a transformation. The shy wallflower in the oversized sweater was vanishing, and a musical genius was taking her place right in front of their eyes. The silence that had filled the hall before was gone, replaced by a roaring storm of sound. But the silence inside the people's heads, the judgment, the boredom, the low expectations, that was gone too. In its place was a growing sense of awe. They were realizing, one by one, that they had completely misjudged the girl at the piano. And the best part was, she was just getting started. The music was no longer just a sound. It was a living, breathing force that had taken control of the room. What started as a shock was now turning into a mesmerizing storm. The tempo increased, pushing past the limit of what seemed humanly possible. Elara's right hand was moving so fast that her fingers were just a blur in the air, like the wings of a hummingbird. The sound coming from the piano wasn't a series of individual notes anymore. It was a flowing river of sound, cascade of melody that drowned out every thought. In the heads of the audience, the physicality of the performance was shocking to watch. Elara wasn't sitting still like a polite student. She was fully into the music. As the notes climbed higher and higher, she would lift her whole upper body. Leaning over the keys as if she was trying to pull the sound out of the piano, her messy bun was starting to come loose. A few stray strands of hair fell across her face, but she didn't brush them away. She didn't even blink. Her eyes were fixed intensely on her hands, but it looked like she was seeing something else entirely, something only she could hear. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Just minutes ago, she looked like a mouse in a room full of lions. Now she was the lion, The oversized gray sweater that made her look small and fragile was now flying around her as she moved, making her look like a conductor leading an invisible orchestra. The audience was witnessing a complete transformation. It wasn't just a girl playing a song. It was a person setting their soul free. It was happening right in front of them. In the third row, a man who had been resting his chin on his hand, looking completely bored, slowly sat up straight. His mouth opened slightly. He stopped looking at his watch. He stopped looking around the room. His eyes were glued to the stage. He didn't know classical music. He didn't know the difference between Beethoven and Bach, but he knew power when he saw it. He knew that what was happening on that stage was special. He could feel the energy of the music hitting him in the chest, vibrating through the seat he was sitting in. It was impossible to look away. The teenagers in the back, who had been ready to mock and laugh, were now dead silent. They were looking at each other with wide eyes, eyebrows raised in disbelief. They whispered, but this time it wasn't mean. "Whoa," one mouthed silently. "Is this real?" Another whispered. They were seeing someone their own age doing something incredible, and it shattered their cool, detached attitude. They were witnessing a masterclass in talent. It commanded respect whether they wanted to give it or not. The judges were having the hardest time of all. The main judge, the one who had been ready to write her off, was now staring at her hands. He was a professional. He knew music. He knew how difficult it was to play that fast without making mistakes. He was looking for the slip-up. He was waiting for the moment where she would lose the rhythm, where her fingers would get tangled, where she would miss a key. But it never happened. Her accuracy was terrifyingly perfect. Every note was distinct. Every rhythm was precise. It was like watching a machine, but with so much emotion that a machine could never replicate. He put his pen down. He didn't need it. He couldn't grade this with a number. He just leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms, a small smile starting to form on his serious face. He realized, just like everyone else, that he had been completely wrong. He wasn't judging a beginner. He was listening to a prodigy. The music itself was telling a story. It wasn't just loud noise. It had soft, delicate moments where Elira's fingers would barely graze the keys, creating a sound like rain falling on a window. The hall would become deadly quiet, the audience hanging on every whisper of sound. And then, without warning, she would crash back into the loud, thundering chords, shaking the floorboards. It was an emotional roller coaster. She took the room up, then down, then up again, holding everyone's heart in her hands and squeezing it. Sweat was now visibly glistening on Elira's forehead. She was working hard. You could see the effort in her face, in the way her jaw clenched, in the way her shoulders moved with the beat. But she didn't look tired. She looked energized. It was like the piano was feeding her. The more she played, the more powerful she became. The air around her seemed to crackle with electricity. The stage lights reflected off the black piano, making it shine. But she was the one glowing. The room felt different now. The stale, boring atmosphere from the beginning of the night was completely gone. It was replaced by a thick, heavy excitement. You could feel the adrenaline in the air. People were leaning forward in their seats, literally on the edge of their chairs. Strangers were looking at each other, sharing a moment of shared wonder. No one was thinking about leaving. No one was thinking about the bathroom or their phone. They were captivated. They were trapped in the magic of the moment. It is rare to see someone do something with their whole heart and soul. Usually, people hold back. They are afraid of looking foolish, of making a mistake. But Elira was holding nothing back. She was pouring every ounce of herself into the music. It was raw, and it was real. And because it was so real, it connected with everyone watching. Even if they didn't know her, they felt like they knew her. They felt her anger, her joy, her passion. She was speaking to them without saying a single word. The piece she was playing was reaching a level of difficulty that seemed insane. Her hands were crossing over each other, one moving up while the other moved down, weaving a complex web of sound. The bass notes were rumbling like thunder, while the high notes were sparkling like lightning. The combination was intense. It filled the entire hall, echoing off the back walls, surrounding the audience. They weren't just hearing the music, they were inside it. An older woman near the front, who had been knitting a scarf casually when Alara walked out, had stopped knitting. Her needles were resting in her lap, forgotten. She had tears in her eyes. She remembered playing when she was a little girl, and she knew the struggle, the discipline it took. Seeing this young woman play with such fire brought back memories and emotions she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just seeing a performance, she was seeing a dream come true. The energy in the room was building, climbing towards a peak. Everyone could feel it. The music was getting faster, louder, more intense. Alara was leaning further over the keys, her hair wild, her face flushed with exertion. It felt like a storm that was about to break. The audience was breathless, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm. They knew something big was coming. They could sense the climax approaching. The silence of the crowd was no longer polite boredom. It was a terrified, thrilled anticipation. They were witnessing the fire, and now they were just waiting to see how high the flames would go. She had them. Every single person in that room belonged to her now. The music wasn't just fast anymore. It was explosive. It felt like the atmosphere in the hall had changed completely, shifting from a room full of people to the inside of a raging storm. Alara was hitting the keys with a force that seemed impossible for someone her size. Every time her hands came down, the piano roared back at her. It was a conversation of power, and she was winning. The sound was so deep and heavy that you could feel it rattling your own bones, vibrating through the floor and up the legs of the chairs, shaking everyone in the room. At this point, the audience wasn't just watching. They were physically reacting. The teenager in the back row, who had been slouching, was now sitting bolt upright, his eyes wide and unblinking. The older lady in the front had stopped knitting entirely, her hands resting forgotten in her lap as she stared at the stage with tears in her eyes. Even the people who were checking their phones had put them down, face down on their laps. No one dared look away. It was as if the music had cast a spell over the entire hall, locking their eyes to the girl in the oversized sweater. Alara looked like she was in a trance. Her head was bent low, her face inches from the keys, her hair falling loose around her face. Sweat was dripping down her forehead, but she didn't wipe it away. She didn't seem to feel it. She was lost in a world where only she and the piano existed. Her fingers were flying across the keyboard, leaping from one end to the other with impossible speed. It looked like magic. How could a human brain send signals that fast? How could fingers move that precisely without tangling up? It was a display of physical and mental control that left everyone breathless. The complexity of the music was stunning. She was playing 10 notes at once. It seemed melody in the right hand, a complicated rhythm in the left, and a deep, driving bass that shook the walls. The sound swelled and grew, getting louder and louder, filling every corner of the vast hall. It felt like the ceiling was lifting up to let the sound out into the night sky. The quiet, polite girl who had walked onto the stage just 10 minutes ago was gone. In her place was a fierce, passionate warrior who was conquering the instrument. The judges had completely abandoned their composure. The main judge, the one who had looked so bored and tired, is now leaning so far forward on the table that he was almost falling off. His pen was nowhere to be seen. He was watching Alara's hands with a look of pure shock on his face. He knew in that moment that he was witnessing something that didn't happen often. He was seeing true greatness. He turned to look at the other judges, and they were all looking at him, their faces mirroring his own disbelief. They knew they weren't judging a contest anymore. They were witnessing history. The music reached a point where it felt like it couldn't get any faster or any louder. But then, it did. Alara's hands became a blur, a ghostly motion above the keys. The notes were coming so fast that they blended together into a long, continuous scream of sound. It was intense, almost scary, like watching a car race at 200 miles an hour. You were terrified something would go wrong, but you couldn't look away because it was so beautiful. The energy in the room was electric, bouncing off the walls and feeding back into Alara. You could feel the adrenaline pumping through the air. People in the audience started to feel emotional, even if they didn't know why. It wasn't just the skill, it was the emotion she was pouring into the keys. She wasn't just playing notes. She was pouring out her heart, her frustrations, her dreams, her everything. It was raw and unfiltered. Every crash of a chord felt like a shout of joy or a scream of anger. Every delicate run of high notes felt like a whisper of sadness. It was a roller coaster of feelings, and she was taking the entire audience along for the ride. A man in the middle row, a stranger to her, found himself holding his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt like he was running a race just by listening to her. The piano itself was shaking. It was a massive, heavy instrument made of wood and metal, built to withstand a lot, but Alara was pushing it to its limit. You could see the lid vibrating with every strike of the hammers inside. The sound was rich and full, filling the hall until there was no room for anything else. No thoughts, no worries, no boredom. Just the music. It was a wall of sound that washed over everyone, cleansing the room of the tired, cynical atmosphere that had been there at the start. Alara's body was swaying violently now. She was moving with the rhythm, rocking back and forth, lifting herself off the bench to strike the high notes with force. She was using her whole body to play, not just her fingers. Her back was straight, her muscles tense, her grip on the keys firm but controlled. It was an athletic performance as much as a musical one. She was sweating freely now, her clothes sticking to her, but she didn't care. The physical effort was immense, but she looked like she could keep playing forever. She was fueled by the fire inside her. The crowd was completely mesmerized. The silence that had been so judgmental at the beginning was now a silence of total awe. No one moved. No one coughed. No one whispered. Hundreds of people were holding their breath, afraid that even the smallest sound might break the spell. They were witnessing a moment of pure magic, a moment where time seemed to stop. It was the kind of performance that people would talk about for years. "Did you see that girl at the talent show?" they would ask. "The one in the gray sweater? She changed everything." The music built up to a crescendo that felt like the peak of a mountain. The notes were rushing down like a waterfall, crashing into the pool at the bottom. It was chaotic, but perfectly organized. It was wild, but completely controlled. The tension in the room was stretched to the breaking point. Everyone could feel that the end was coming, that the fire was about to reach its highest point. Alara's hands were moving faster than ever, a blur of motion, a whirlwind of sound. She was playing with a kind of desperation and passion that was rare to see. She was giving everything she had, leaving nothing on the table, just when it felt like the music couldn't possibly get any more intense. She hit a series of chords that shook the entire hall. It was a thundering roar, a declaration of power. The sound seemed to hang in the air for a second, vibrating through the floor, shaking the windows, echoing in everyone's ears. It was the peak of the storm. It was the heart of the fire. The audience was on the edge of a collective heart attack, their hearts pounding in sync with the rhythm, their eyes glued to the stage, completely overwhelmed by the sheer force of the girl and the piano. The storm on the piano had reached its absolute peak. It was a chaos of sound that was impossible to understand, but impossible to ignore. Alara's hands were moving faster than the human eye could track, blurring into a ghostly motion above the keys. The music was screaming now, a roaring wall of sound that filled the entire hall, shaking the dust from the rafters and vibrating through the floorboards. Every person in the room felt the power of it in their chest. It was intense, aggressive, and beautiful. She wasn't just playing a song. She was fighting a battle with the instrument, and she was winning. Then, with a sudden sharp intake of breath that everyone could see from the back row, she lifted her hands high above her head.
"I'll see."
She brought them down one last time, striking a massive, deep chord that seemed to split the air in half. It was a thunderclap. It was the final slam of a door. The sound was so loud and resonant that it felt like the ground shook beneath their feet. And then, everything stopped. Alara held her pose, her hands suspended in the air, her fingers curled tight. The piano sat silent. But the sound didn't disappear immediately. It hung in the air like a heavy cloud, ringing in everyone's ears, bouncing off the high ceiling and the hard walls. The silence that followed was heavier and louder than the noise had been. It was the kind of silence that happens when something truly shocking occurs, when hundreds of people all forget to breathe at the same time. For 5 long seconds, no one moved. The man with the pen was frozen, his mouth open. The teenagers in the back were leaning forward, stunned. The knitting lady had stopped crying, but her hands were still pressed against her chest. The hall was completely still. Could have heard a pin drop or the beating of a nervous heart. It was a moment of pure electric shock. The reality of what they had just witnessed was sinking in. They had judged a book by its cover, and the book had blown up in their faces. Slowly, Ilara lowered her hands to her lap.
Ow.
The fierce, wild look in her eyes began to fade. She took a deep, ragged breath, her chest heaving from the physical effort. Sweat was dripping down her face, making her makeup-free skin shine under the hot stage lights. She looked exhausted, but in a way that was peaceful. She released the tension in her shoulders, and the powerful warrior vanished. Suddenly, she looked like the shy girl in the oversized sweater again. That was the moment the dam broke. It started in the front row. One person stood up, then another. Then a clapping sound started, hesitant at first, then louder. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet. The applause wasn't just polite clapping, it was a roar. It was a tidal wave of noise that crashed over the stage. People were shouting, cheering, and whistling. A group of college students in the balcony were stomping their feet, making the metal railing rattle. The energy in the room had flipped completely from boredom to pure, unfiltered excitement. The judges were caught up in it too. The main judge, the one who looked like he never smiled, was standing with his hands clapping high above his head. He was grinning, a genuine, delighted smile. He looked at the other judges and shook his head, laughing in disbelief. They all knew that the contest was over. There was no point in having anyone else perform. Lara had won before they even filled out the scorecards. They weren't judges anymore. They were just fans who had been lucky enough to get a front row seat to a miracle. Ilara sat on the bench for a moment, taking it all in. She looked out at the sea of standing people, the flashing lights of phones recording her, the smiling faces. But she didn't look surprised. She didn't look arrogant.
Ow.
She reached up and used the sleeve of her gray sweater to wipe the sweat from her forehead. It was a messy, unglamorous gesture, but it made her seem more real. She wasn't a polished celebrity. She was a human being who had just poured her heart out. She stood up slowly. Her legs looked a little shaky, like she might fall, but she held her ground. She walked to the center of the stage, right in front of the microphone. The crowd cheered even louder, thinking she was going to say something. They expected a speech. They wanted to hear her voice, to know who she was, to understand how she hid such a massive fire inside such a small frame. But Ilara didn't speak. She just bowed. It was a simple, quick bow. She didn't milk it. She didn't wave or blow kisses. She didn't try to be a star. She just nodded her head respectfully to the audience and to the judges, acknowledging their applause but seemingly detached from it. It was as if she knew that the music wasn't about her. It was about the sound itself. And now that the sound was over, her job was done. She turned around and walked back toward the piano one last time, not to play, but to close the lid. She pushed it down gently, a soft thud that was barely audible over the cheering. It was the final period on the sentence. She turned back to. The audience gave one small, shy smile that barely reached her eyes, and then walked off the stage. As soon as she stepped into the wings, the curtains began to close. The audience groaned in disappointment, wanting her to come back for an encore. 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 People started chanting, stomping their feet, but the curtains kept moving, sealing off the stage. The piano was gone. The girl was gone. Back in the hall, the crowd didn't leave. They stayed standing, talking excitedly amongst themselves. The atmosphere was buzzing with electricity. Strangers were high-fiving. The man who wanted popcorn was talking animatedly to his wife, gesturing wildly with his hands. The bored teenagers were still staring at the stage, their minds blown. The story of the performance was already spreading through the room. Everyone felt like they were part of a secret club, the people who were there when the quiet girl set the piano on fire. The judges were huddled together, talking rapidly. They were discussing how they could possibly score this. How do you give a number to perfection? They knew that the next day, the talk of the town wouldn't be the judges or the venue. it would be her. People would be talking about this night for years. Remember that girl in the sweater? They would say, the one who played like a demon? Alara, meanwhile, was walking down the long, dark hallway backstage. She was alone. The roar of the crowd was muffled here, distant. She grabbed her bag from a chair in the corner. She pulled her hair tie out, letting her hair fall completely loose. She took a drink of water from a bottle, her hand shaking just a little bit as she lifted it. She didn't look like a conquering hero. She looked tired, but if you looked closely, you could see it. You could see the quiet satisfaction in her eyes. She knew what she had done. She didn't need a trophy or a scorecard to tell her she was good. She had proved it to herself, and she had proved it to the hundreds of people who had underestimated her. She pushed the heavy back door open and stepped out into the cool night air. The noise of the theater was left behind her. She walked toward the bus stop, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of her jeans. She was just a young woman walking home alone. The oversized sweater looked just like a sweater again. The face looked just like a regular face. But the air around her felt different. The world felt different because she had shown everyone who was really in control. She didn't look back at the theater. She didn't need to. She knew that inside that building people were still cheering, still stunned, still realizing that you should never, ever judge a book by its cover. She smiled a tiny, private smile into the darkness, and then she disappeared. Into the night, leaving the fire behind her, burning bright in the memories of everyone who was lucky enough to hear it.